I'll give you all my cattle. Just make me a mother, the abandoned wife whispered to the Apache. The rifle shot echoed across the canyon just as Margaret Holloway finished burying her third miscarried child beneath the cottonwood tree. Her husband Clayton had ridden off 6 months ago with a woman from the saloon, leaving her alone on a cattle ranch she couldn't manage, and a body that wouldn't give her the one thing she'd prayed for since she was 16. The Apache warrior stood at the edge of her property line, watching her pat down the small grave with dirt-stained hands. She didn't reach for the Winchester leaning against the tree. Something in his stillness told her he wasn't there to raid or kill. He was older than she'd expected, with silver threading through his long black hair and eyes that seemed to measure the weight of her grief without flinching from it. "You bury often," he said, in clear English that surprised her. Margaret stood slowly, her knees aching from kneeling. 3 times in 4 years. Your man? Gone. Took everything worth taking except the cattle and this cursed land. The Apache moved closer, and she noticed the medicine bag at his belt and the ceremonial marks on his leather vest. Not a warrior, then, or not just a warrior. "I am called Nadez. I watch the white settlements. I see many things. Then you've seen me fail over and over." Margaret's voice cracked, despite her efforts to keep it steady. The loneliness came out in waves now, hitting her when she least expected it. "I'm 32 years old, and I'll die without ever holding my own child." Nadez studied the grave, then the ranch house sagging on its foundation, then the hundreds of cattle dotting the brown hills beyond. "Your people take much from mine. Land, water, freedom. But we have something your medicine cannot touch." Margaret felt her heart hammer against her ribs. "What are you saying? The old ways, the ceremonies your priests call devil work." He met her eyes directly. "I can give you what you want, but the price is not small. I have money, not much, but I do not want your coins." Nadez gestured at the cattle spread across the valley. 500 head, maybe more. Enough to feed my people through 2 winters while we move north to the territories where your soldiers don't reach. Margaret's breath caught. Those cattle represented everything Clayton had left behind, the only thing standing between her and complete destitution. But what good was wealth when you had no one to leave it to, no purpose beyond surviving one empty day after another? "All of them," she whispered. "I'll give you every single cow on this ranch. Just make me a mother." Nadez nodded slowly. 3 nights from now, when the moon is dark, you will come to the sacred springs in Black Canyon. Alone. Bring nothing but yourself and your faith that the old powers still work in this world your people try to tame. Will it hurt? Everything worth having comes with pain. You know this already. He turned to leave, then paused. If you change your mind, no shame comes to you. But once the ceremony begins, there is no walking away from what follows. The spirits do not make bargains lightly. Margaret watched him disappear into the scrub brush and wondered if she'd just made a deal that would save her or destroy her. She looked down at the fresh grave and knew she would go to those springs, no matter what it cost. She had already lost everything that mattered. What was a herd of cattle compared to the chance of finally becoming what she was meant to be? The next 3 days crawled by like wounded animals. Margaret tried to work the ranch, but her hands shook every time she thought about what she'd agreed to. Her neighbor Pete Morrison rode by on the second day, asking if she needed help mending the fence line. She sent him away with excuses that sounded hollow even to her own ears. If anyone knew what she planned to do, they'd call her crazy or worse. On the 3rd night, she saddled her horse under a moonless sky so black she could barely see her own hands. The ride to Black Canyon took 2 hours through country she normally avoided after dark. Apache territory, people called it, though the army had pushed most of the tribes onto reservations years ago. But Nadez and his people clearly hadn't accepted that fate. She found the springs exactly where he'd described, a pool of water fed by underground streams that steamed even in the cool night air. Nadez waited beside a small fire, and she saw at least a dozen other Apache gathered in the shadows beyond the light. Warriors, women, elders, all watching her with expressions she couldn't read. "You came," Nadez said. "I gave my word." Margaret dismounted, her legs unsteady. "What happens now?" "Now you learn if the spirits find you worthy." Part 2, Nadez gestured for Margaret to sit beside the fire, and she lowered herself onto a flat rock that still held the day's heat. The other Apache remained in the shadows, silent as the stones themselves. She could feel their eyes on her, measuring, judging. Her hands trembled in her lap, and she clasped them together to hide her fear. "You must understand what you ask," Nadez began, settling cross-legged across the fire from her. The flames cast dancing shadows across his weathered face. "The ceremony I will perform draws on powers older than your churches, older than the missions your people built on our sacred grounds. These powers answer to different laws than the ones your doctors know." Margaret nodded, unable to find her voice. "Your body refuses to carry life because it carries too much death," Nadez continued. "Not the children you buried before that. Inside you lives a darkness that poisons new life before it can take root." "I don't understand." "What darkness?" "Grief. Rage. The kind that grows when a woman gives everything to a man who sees her only as something to be used and discarded." Nadez leaned forward. "Your husband did not just leave you. He took pieces of you with him. Your trust, your belief in yourself, your certainty that you deserve love. These missing pieces left holes, and holes cannot nurture life." Tears burned in Margaret's eyes. She'd spent months telling herself Clayton's abandonment didn't matter, that she was strong enough to survive alone. But Nadez spoke truths she'd buried deep as those tiny graves under the cottonwood tree. "Can you fix it?" she whispered. "I cannot, but you can, with the Spirit's help. They will show you what needs to be released before new life can grow." Nadez reached into his medicine bag and withdrew a bundle of dried herbs. "This will open doorways in your mind. You will see visions. Some will be pleasant. Most will not be. You must face them all without turning away." He crushed the herbs in his palm and tossed them onto the fire. Thick smoke billowed up, sweet and acrid at once. Margaret breathed it in and felt the world tilt sideways. The fire grew impossibly tall, reaching toward the starless sky. She heard chanting in a language she didn't know but somehow understood. The words spoke of earth and blood and the ancient contract between women and the forces that govern birth and death. Nada's voice wove through the chanting, low and steady as a heartbeat. Then the visions began. She saw herself at 19, young and hopeful, marrying Clayton in a church filled with people who'd assured her she was making a fine match. She saw the first time he'd raised his hand to her, 3 months into their marriage, and the way she'd made excuses for him. She saw the miscarriages, one after another, and Clayton's growing coldness each time. She saw him in bed with other women while she lay alone, praying for a miracle that never came. But the visions didn't stop there. They pushed deeper, further back. She saw her own mother, worn down by 13 pregnancies that produced only 2 surviving children. She saw her grandmother, dead from complications of childbirth at 35. She saw generations of women in her family, all trapped in the same cycle of hoping and breaking and trying to be enough for men who took everything and gave nothing back. "No," Margaret heard herself say, "no more." The visions shifted. Now she saw the land itself, the ranch she'd worked until her hands bled trying to keep it running after Clayton left. She saw how she'd poured all her grief and rage into those cattle, into the fences and the water troughs and the endless labor that let her collapse into dreamless sleep each night. She'd been punishing herself, she realized, trying to earn through suffering what Clayton had refused to give her freely. "Let it go," Nadez's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "Let it burn away." Margaret felt something break loose inside her chest, something hard and jagged she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was there. She sobbed great heaving cries that tore through her like labor pains. The Apache women emerged from the shadows now, surrounding her, their hands gentle on her shoulders and back. They understood. They'd all carried similar weights. The fire blazed higher, and Margaret saw one final vision. A child, neither boy nor girl yet, just a bright spark of possibility. It hovered just beyond her reach, waiting. Patient. It had always been waiting, she understood now. Waiting for her to make room for it, waiting for her to believe she deserved it. "I'm ready," she said aloud. "I'm ready now." Nadez began painting symbols on her face and hands with clay mixed from the sacred spring water. Each mark tingled against her skin, warm and alive. He chanted continuously, and the women chanted with him, their voices rising and falling like wind through canyons. Margaret felt herself becoming part of something larger than her individual pain, connected to every woman who'd ever yearned for a child and every spirit that had ever answered such yearning. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time moved strangely here. Nadez finally helped her stand and led her to the edge of the spring. The water glowed faintly in the darkness, illuminated by something beneath the surface. "You must go under," he said, 3 times. "Each time you leave something behind. Fear. Shame. The lie that you are not enough. When you surface the 3rd time, you will be ready to receive what you've asked for." Margaret didn't hesitate. She walked into the spring fully clothed, feeling the hot water rise around her legs, her waist, her chest. When it reached her shoulders, she took a deep breath and submerged herself completely. The world above disappeared. She floated in warm darkness, and in that darkness she confronted her fear. Fear of failing again. Fear of hoping and being crushed. Fear that she was too broken to be fixed. She acknowledged each fear, named it, and then released it like ashes on the wind. She surfaced, gasping. Again, Nadez commanded. The second time under, she faced her shame. Shame at not being able to keep her husband. Shame at her body's failures. Shame at wanting so desperately what everyone said should come naturally. She held the shame close for one long moment, feeling its full weight, and then she let it sink to the bottom of the spring where it belonged. She surfaced again, lighter now, once more. The third time she released the deepest lie, the belief that she wasn't enough, that she needed to earn love through perfection, through suffering, through being smaller and quieter and more grateful than she naturally was. She watched that lie dissolve in the sacred water and knew she would never carry it again. When she surfaced the third time, she felt fundamentally changed. Not fixed, because she hadn't been broken, but cleared, like a channel that had been blocked and now flowed freely again. Nadez helped her from the spring. The Apache women wrapped her in blankets and sat with her while she shivered, though whether from cold or from the magnitude of what had just happened, she couldn't say. "It is done," Nadez said quietly. "The spirits have accepted your offering. They have cleared the way." "When will I know if it worked?" Margaret asked. "You already know." And she did feel it. Something fundamental had shifted inside her. A space that had been closed was now open. A possibility that had been impossible now existed. "The cattle?" she said. "I need to gather them for you. In 3 days, my people will come to your ranch. We will take them peacefully, and your neighbors will believe we raided you. This is better. They will not ask questions you cannot answer." Margaret nodded. She understood the wisdom in this. How could she explain to Pete Morrison or anyone else what she'd done tonight? They would think her possessed or insane. Part 3. The ride back to the ranch felt like traveling between two different worlds. Margaret's clothes dried stiff against her skin as her horse picked its way through the darkness, but she barely noticed the discomfort. Everything looked different now, sharper somehow, as if she'd been seeing through clouded glass her whole life and someone had finally wiped it clean. The stars overhead seemed close enough to touch, and she could smell the sage and creosote on the night wind with an intensity that made her dizzy. By the time she reached the ranch house, dawn was breaking pink and gold across the eastern hills. She unsaddled her horse with mechanical efficiency, her body moving through familiar motions while her mind struggled to process what had happened at the springs. Had it been real? Had she really made a bargain with Apache spirits, or had those herbs simply sent her into vivid hallucinations? But when she pressed her hand against her lower belly, she felt it, a warmth there that hadn't existed before. A readiness. Her body knew something had changed even if her rational mind wanted to deny it. She fell into bed without undressing and slept deeper than she had in years. No nightmares came. Instead, she dreamed of a child laughing in the sunlight, running through tall grass she couldn't quite see clearly. The dream filled her with such profound peace that when she woke near noon, she found herself smiling. The next 3 days passed in a strange state of waiting. Margaret went through the motions of ranch work, feeding the chickens and checking the water pump, but her heart wasn't in it. She kept touching her belly, feeling for signs of change. Too early, she knew. If the ceremony had worked at all, it would be weeks before she could be certain. On the third evening, she heard the thunder of hooves approaching from the north. Her heart leapt into her throat even though she'd been expecting this. She stepped out onto the porch and watched as dozens of Apache riders swept down from the hills, surrounding her cattle with practiced efficiency. They moved like water flowing around stones, cutting out groups of cattle and driving them northward with barely a sound. Nadez rode at the front of the group. He stopped his horse near her porch and looked at her for a long moment. "You do not fight," he observed. "We had an agreement. Many of your people make agreements with mine and break them before the words stop echoing." He gestured at the cattle being driven away in a river of brown hides and dust. "You honor your word. This is rare." "Will I see you again?" Margaret asked, surprising herself with the question. "If the spirits are kind to you, perhaps our paths will cross. If not, then know that my people will remember you, the white woman who paid her debts and did not lie." He touched 2 fingers to his forehead in some kind of salute, then wheeled his horse around and galloped after the others. Margaret watched until the last of the cattle disappeared over the northern ridge. She stood alone on her porch, owner of nothing but an aging ranch house and 40 acres of scrub land, and felt lighter than she had in a decade. The neighbors came the next morning, as Nadez had predicted. Pete Morrison arrived first, his face grim with concern. Behind him rode Sheriff Frank Cooper and a hastily assembled posse of 6 other ranchers. "We heard about the raid," Pete said, dismounting quickly. "Are you hurt? Did they harm you?" Margaret had prepared her story carefully. "I was inside when they came. Must have been 30 or 40 of them. They had the cattle rounded up and gone before I could even grab my rifle. Happened so fast I barely saw them." Sheriff Cooper spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Apache? I think so. Couldn't tell for certain in the darkness." "Damn it," Pete muttered. "We thought they'd all moved to the reservations up north. The army's going to have to deal with this before someone gets killed." Margaret felt a spike of fear. "You're not going after them? With 6 men against a war party that size?" "I'm angry, Margaret, not stupid." Sheriff Cooper adjusted his hat against the rising sun. "I'll send a telegraph to Fort Davidson. Let the army handle it. This is their jurisdiction anyway." The men spent an hour riding over her property looking for tracks and evidence. Margaret stood on her porch and forced herself to appear distraught, wringing her hands and dabbing at her eyes with her apron. Inside, she counted the minutes until they would leave her alone again. "You can't stay here by yourself," Pete said as the posse prepared to ride out. "Not with hostile Indians in the area. Pack some things and come stay with me and Linda. We've got room. I appreciate the offer, but this is my home. I'm not leaving it." "Margaret, be reasonable." I said no. She softened her tone, seeing Pete's genuine concern. "I'll keep my rifle loaded and my doors locked. If there's trouble, I'll fire 3 shots and someone will hear." Pete looked like he wanted to argue further, but Sheriff Cooper called him back to his horse. The posse rode off in a cloud of dust, and Margaret finally allowed herself to breathe normally again. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Margaret's life. Without cattle to tend, she had nothing but time. She cleaned the ranch house from top to bottom, scrubbing years of accumulated dust and neglect from every corner. She replanted the vegetable garden that had gone to weeds. She fixed the broken shutters and patched the holes in the roof where rain leaked through during storms. And she waited. A month after the ceremony at the springs, she woke one morning feeling different. Not sick exactly, but changed. Her breasts felt tender and swollen. Certain smells made her nauseous in a way they never had before. She was 3 weeks late for her monthly courses, though that had happened before during times of stress. Still, she knew. Her body was telling her what her mind almost couldn't believe. She was pregnant. Margaret sat down heavily in her kitchen chair and pressed both hands against her belly. Life grew there. After all the years of trying and failing, after burying 3 tiny bodies under the cottonwood tree, after watching her marriage collapse under the weight of disappointment, life finally grew there. The joy hit her so hard she couldn't breathe. Then came the terror. What if she lost this one, too? What if her body still couldn't carry a child to term despite the ceremony? What if the spirits had lied? No, she told herself firmly. She had to trust. She had given everything she owned in exchange for this chance. She had to believe it would work. She told no one. What could she say? That she'd made a bargain with an Apache medicine man and traded her entire herd for the promise of a child? They'd lock her up or drive her out of town for consorting with the enemy, so she kept quiet and went about her days as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. 2 months in, her belly began to swell visibly. She started wearing loose dresses and avoided going into town. When Pete Morrison rode by to check on her, she spoke to him from inside the house, making excuses about a persistent cough that kept her bedridden. "You need a doctor, Margaret," Pete called through the door. "This isn't healthy, you isolating yourself out here." "I'm fine. Just need rest." "At least let Linda come visit. She's worried sick about you. Tell her I'm grateful, but I need to be alone right now." "Please, Pete. Respect that." She heard him sigh heavily, but eventually he rode away. Margaret knew she was burning bridges with her strange behavior, but she couldn't risk anyone discovering her condition. Not yet. Not until she was further along and certain the pregnancy would last. Part 4, 3 months became 4, and 4 became 5. Margaret's belly grew round and firm, undeniable proof that something impossible was happening. She spent her days talking to the child inside her, telling it stories about the ranch and the land and all the things they would do together when it was born. She promised to be a better mother than her own mother had been, to raise a child who knew they were wanted and loved without condition. The isolation wore on her, but she endured it. She had endured worse. At night, she sometimes walked out to the cottonwood tree where those 3 small graves lay and whispered apologies to the children she'd lost. She hoped they understood, wherever they were, that she hadn't forgotten them, that this new life didn't replace them but honored their brief existence by finally succeeding where they couldn't. One morning in her 6th month, she woke to find an Apache woman sitting on her porch. Not someone she recognized from the ceremony, but clearly one of Nadez's people. The woman was young, maybe 20, with intelligent eyes and a serene expression. Margaret stepped outside cautiously, one hand on her swollen belly. "Can I help you?" "I am called Little Bird," the woman said in careful English. "Nadez sends me to watch over you. Make sure the child comes safely. I don't need watching over. The spirits gave you this gift, but they do not guarantee it will come easily. First births are difficult. More difficult when the mother is older and alone." Little Bird stood and gestured at the ranch house. "I will stay. Help you prepare. When your time comes, I will be there." Margaret wanted to refuse, but the truth was she was terrified. She had no idea what to do when labor started, no one to turn to for help. Pride wouldn't deliver a healthy baby. She stepped aside and let Little Bird enter her home. The Apache woman proved to be a blessing Margaret hadn't known she needed. Little Bird taught her exercises to strengthen her body for birth. She prepared teas and poultices from herbs gathered in the hills, explaining what each one did and when to use it. She showed Margaret how to breathe through pain, how to position herself when contractions began, how to push when the time came. But more than the practical knowledge, Little Bird provided companionship. For the first time in months, Margaret had someone to talk to who didn't judge or question. Little Bird understood the bargain she'd made because her people had been making such bargains with the spirits for generations. "You were brave to do what you did," Little Bird said, one evening as they sat together shelling beans. "Many white women think our ways are evil, the work of devils. But the spirits care nothing for the boundaries your people draw. They answer those who come to them with honest hearts and fair payment. Do you think my child will be normal?" Margaret asked quietly. It was a fear she'd carried since the ceremony but never voiced. Some people believe children conceived through magic are cursed or wrong somehow. Little Bird laughed, a bright sound that filled the kitchen. You think spirits deal in curses? They deal in balance. You paid in cattle what you could not create in flesh. The debt is settled. Your child will be as any other child, healthy and whole and entirely yours." Margaret felt relief wash through her. She'd needed to hear that from someone who understood these matters better than she did. As her 7th month arrived, Margaret's isolation finally drew the attention she'd been dreading. Sheriff Cooper rode out to the ranch with Pete Morrison, and this time they wouldn't take no for an answer. They walked right up to her door and knocked loudly. "Margaret Holloway, you open this door right now or I'm breaking it down," the sheriff called out. "Pete's wife is convinced you're dead in there, and I'm inclined to believe her given how you've been acting." Margaret glanced at Little Bird, who had already slipped out the back door as they'd planned for situations like this. Then she opened the door just wide enough to show her face. "I'm alive, as you can see. Now please leave me be." But Sheriff Cooper had wedged his boot in the doorway. His eyes widened as he took in her appearance. Even loose dresses couldn't hide her condition anymore. "Sweet merciful Lord," Pete breathed. "Margaret, are you—" "Yes," she lifted her chin defiantly. 7 months along. "And before you ask, the father is gone and not coming back. I'm having this baby alone, and I don't need or want any help from town." The two men stared at her in shock. Sheriff Cooper finally found his voice. "Does Clayton know? Clayton lost the right to know anything about my life when he abandoned me for a saloon girl. This child is mine, and mine alone." "But Margaret, you can't raise a baby out here by yourself," Pete protested. "You need help. Medical care. What if something goes wrong during the birth?" "I'll manage. The hell you will." Sheriff Cooper's face had gone red. "I don't care what happened between you and Clayton or who the father of that baby is. No woman should give birth without a doctor present. I'm sending Doc Henderson out here whether you like it or not. You'll do no such thing. It wasn't a request." The sheriff turned and walked back to his horse, clearly expecting the matter to be settled. Pete lingered, his expression conflicted. "Margaret, I know you've had a hard time. We all know what Clayton did to you. But you don't have to face this alone. Let people help you. I appreciate your concern, Pete, but I've made my choice. Please respect it." He shook his head sadly, but followed the sheriff. Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, her heart hammering. Little Bird emerged from the bedroom where she'd been hiding. "They will send the doctor," she said, "and when he comes, he will ask questions you cannot answer." "I know." Margaret pressed her hands to her belly, feeling the baby kick strongly. "But what choice do I have? If I refuse medical help and something goes wrong, they'll blame themselves. And if I accept it, the doctor will want to examine me. He'll know this pregnancy is different somehow." "How could he know?" "I don't know. But doctors have ways of measuring things, checking development. What if he discovers something unusual?" Little Bird considered this. Then we tell him the truth. Not all of it, but enough. That you sought help from a medicine woman when white doctors told you that you could never have children. Many white people do this in secret and do not speak of it in public. He may judge you, but he cannot prove anything wrong was done. It was a better plan than Margaret had. When Doc Henderson arrived 3 days later, she greeted him at the door with her head held high. He was a round man in his 60s, with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that put her somewhat at ease. "Mrs. Holloway, I'm here to examine you and make sure everything is progressing normally with your pregnancy. I'm aware. The sheriff sent you." "He did, but I would have come anyway once I'd heard. It's my job to look after the health of everyone in this county, whether they want me to or not." He smiled gently. "May I come in?" She led him inside and submitted to his examination with gritted teeth. Little Bird had retreated to the hills again, leaving Margaret truly alone with the doctor and his probing questions. "Everything appears normal," Doc Henderson said as he packed up his instruments. "The baby's heartbeat is strong. You're measuring right for 7 months along. But I have to ask, Mrs. Holloway, when... You came to me 2 years ago. I told you in no uncertain terms that the scarring in your womb meant you would likely never carry a child to term. What changed?" Margaret had prepared for this. "I sought help from a medicine woman. An old Mexican woman down in Arizona Territory. She gave me herbs and performed a healing ritual. I didn't believe it would work, but clearly it did." The doctor's expression grew disapproving. "Mrs. Those folk remedies can be dangerous. You're lucky you didn't poison yourself." "Lucky or blessed, depending on how you look at it." She met his eyes steadily. "I'm having a healthy baby after years of being told it was impossible." "Does it really matter how it happened?" Doc Henderson sighed. "I suppose not. But I'll be checking on you regularly from now until the birth, and when your time comes, you send someone to fetch me immediately. I don't care what that medicine woman told you. I want to be there to make sure both you and the baby survive. Understood?" "Understood." He left her with instructions to rest, eat well, and avoid heavy labor. Part 5, the final 2 months of Margaret's pregnancy passed slowly, each day stretching longer than the last. Her body grew heavy and awkward, and she found herself waddling rather than walking, her back aching constantly from the weight she carried. Little Bird returned after Doc Henderson's visit, moving into the ranch house properly now that the secret was out. The Apache woman proved invaluable, cooking nourishing meals and helping Margaret with tasks that had become impossible to manage alone. Pete Morrison's wife Linda finally made the journey out to the ranch, despite Margaret's previous refusals of company. The older woman took one look at Margaret's swollen belly and tear-stained face and immediately pulled her into a tight embrace. "You stubborn fool," Linda said with a mixture of exasperation and affection. "Did you really think we'd abandon you just because you're having a baby without a husband? Half the women in this county have been through worse, myself included." Margaret found herself crying, something she'd tried hard not to do. I thought you'd judge me. Call me names. I say I brought shame on myself." "Shame?" "The only shame belongs to Clayton Holloway for leaving his wife in the first place." Linda pulled back and cupped Margaret's face in her weathered hands. "You listen to me. Whatever happened that led to this child doesn't matter. What matters is you're bringing a life into this world, and that takes more courage than most men will ever understand. Now, let's see what we need to prepare before this baby decides to arrive." Over the following weeks, Linda became a regular visitor, bringing supplies and companionship. She didn't ask about the baby's father, and Margaret was grateful for the discretion. The two women worked together to prepare the ranch house for the baby's arrival, setting up a cradle that Linda's own children had once used and sewing tiny clothes from fabric Linda brought from town. Little Bird and Linda circled each other warily at first, but eventually found common ground in their shared determination to see Margaret through the birth safely. They taught each other things, Linda showing Little Bird how to use the cast-iron stove properly, Little Bird teaching Linda about herbs that eased pregnancy pains. Margaret watched their unlikely friendship develop and felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the baby kicking her ribs. On a cold November night in Margaret's 9th month, the contractions began. She'd been feeling occasional tightening for days, but this was different. These pains came with regularity and intensity that took her breath away. Little Bird recognized the signs immediately and sent Linda's son racing to town to fetch Doc Henderson. "Walk," Little Bird instructed. Supporting Margaret as another contraction gripped her. "Movement helps the baby come. We walk until your body says to stop." They paced the ranch house for hours, Margaret leaning heavily on Little Bird's strong shoulders each time pain washed through her. Linda arrived shortly after her son left, taking up position on Margaret's other side. Together, the two women held her up through the long night of labor. Doc Henderson arrived near dawn, his medical bag in hand and sleep still heavy in his eyes. He examined Margaret quickly and nodded with satisfaction. "You're progressing well. First babies usually take their time, but this one seems eager to meet the world. Margaret, when the next contraction comes, I want you to bear down and push with everything you've got." The pain was unlike anything Margaret had experienced. It felt like her body was being torn apart from the inside, split open by forces beyond her control. She screamed, not caring who heard or what they thought. Little Bird held one hand and Linda held the other, both women murmuring encouragement that Margaret barely registered through the overwhelming sensation of pressure and burning and the desperate need to push. "I can see the head," Doc Henderson called out. "One more big push, Margaret. Come on now." She gathered every remaining ounce of strength and pushed, feeling something give way inside her. Then, suddenly, miraculously, the pressure released and she heard the most beautiful sound she'd ever encountered in her life. A baby's sharp, indignant cry. "It's a girl," Doc Henderson announced, holding up a tiny, blood-covered infant who wailed lustily at being expelled from her warm home. A healthy, perfect little girl. Margaret sobbed with relief and joy and exhaustion all mingled together. The doctor cleaned the baby quickly and placed her on Margaret's chest, and Margaret looked down at the small face scrunched up in fury and felt her heart expand to sizes she didn't know were possible. "Hello," she whispered. "Hello, my beautiful girl. I've been waiting so long to meet you." The baby quieted at her mother's voice, dark eyes opening to stare up at Margaret with an intensity that seemed almost aware. Margaret touched one tiny hand and marveled when the fingers wrapped around hers with surprising strength. "What will you name her?" Linda asked softly. Margaret didn't hesitate. She'd known the name for months, holding it close like a secret. "Hope. Her name is Hope." Little Bird smiled, understanding the significance. After so many years of hopelessness, after so much loss and pain and empty longing, Margaret had finally found her way to this moment. The ceremony at the sacred springs had worked exactly as Nadez promised. The spirits had cleared the way, and life had found its path into existence. Doc Henderson completed his work, making sure Margaret had no dangerous bleeding, and that the afterbirth had come away cleanly. He examined baby Hope thoroughly and declared her completely healthy, 8 pounds of squalling, perfect infant. "I'll admit I had my doubts," he said as he packed his instruments. "But whatever that medicine woman did, it worked. This is a miracle, Mrs. Holloway. You take good care of that little girl." "I will," Margaret promised, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. The days that followed were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Hope proved to be a hungry baby who fed frequently and slept in short bursts, keeping Margaret awake at all hours, but Margaret didn't care. Each time she looked at her daughter's face, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the bargain she'd made and the price she'd paid. Little Bird stayed for 2 weeks after the birth, teaching Margaret how to care for an infant and helping with the household work while Margaret recovered. On the day she prepared to leave, Margaret walked out to the porch with Hope wrapped in blankets against the winter chill. "Thank you," Margaret said simply, "for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." "You could have," Little Bird replied, "but it would have been harder and lonelier. That is not how children should come into the world." She touched Hope's tiny cheek gently. "She is special, this one, not because of how she was conceived, but because she is so deeply wanted. Children know when they are wanted. It shapes them. Will I see you again? Perhaps, if the spirits will it." Little Bird swung up onto her horse with easy grace. "But whether we meet again or not, remember this. You are not the abandoned wife anymore. You are Hope's mother. Let that be your name now." She rode off toward the northern hills, and Margaret watched until she disappeared. Then she looked down at Hope, who gazed back at her with those dark, knowing eyes. "Just you and me now," Margaret whispered. "And that's enough. That's more than enough." Spring came early that year, bringing warm winds and new grass to the empty ranges where cattle used to graze. Margaret planted a larger garden than before, knowing she'd need to grow as much food as possible to support herself and Hope. Pete Morrison offered her work helping with his cattle during branding season, understanding she needed income. She strapped Hope to her chest in a sling Little Bird had made and worked alongside the men, earning their respect through sheer determination. Word spread through the county about the widow Holloway, who'd had a baby despite doctors saying it was impossible. Some people whispered behind her back, speculating about who the father might be, but most were simply happy for her, recognizing that she'd found joy after years of hardship. The women of the county especially rallied around her, bringing food and hand-me-down clothes and the kind of practical support that meant more than words ever could. One afternoon in late spring, Margaret looked up from her garden to see a rider approaching from the north. Her heart leapt, thinking it might be Little Bird or Nadez, but as the figure came closer, she realized with cold shock that it was Clayton. Her former husband looked thinner than she remembered, his face weathered and his clothes dusty from hard travel. He dismounted slowly and stood at the edge of her property, not quite daring to come closer. "Margaret," he said, "I heard you had a baby." She stood, wiping dirt from her hands, and faced him with her head high. "You heard correctly." "Is it mine?" The question was so absurd she almost laughed. "No, Clayton, it's not yours. You lost any claim to being part of my life when you rode off with that woman from the saloon." He flinched. "I made mistakes. I know that. But when I heard you were pregnant, I thought maybe we could try again. Make things work for the sake of the child." Margaret felt rage rise in her throat, hot and bitter. This man had abandoned her, left her to struggle alone, disappeared for nearly 2 years without a word, and now he wanted to waltz back into her life because she had something he might want? "Get off my property," she said quietly. "Right now." "Margaret, be reasonable. I said get off my property." Her voice rose. "You don't get to come back here and pretend you care. You don't get to claim this child as yours when you weren't here for any of it. Not the pregnancy, not the birth, not the sleepless nights, or the fear, or the joy. You gave up your rights when you left." Clayton's face hardened. "I'm still your husband by law. I have rights." "Then exercise them through a lawyer because you're not welcome here." She turned her back on him deliberately. "Leave, Clayton, and don't come back." She heard him mount his horse, heard the animal's hooves on the packed dirt. But before he rode away, he called out one more time. "This isn't over, Margaret. A man has a right to his own child." She didn't turn around or respond, just kept walking toward the house where Hope was sleeping. When she finally heard Clayton ride away, she allowed herself to shake with the confrontation's aftermath. But underneath the fear and anger, she felt something else too. Strength. The knowledge that she would fight to protect what was hers, that she would never again let Clayton Holloway take anything from her. That evening, she walked out to the cottonwood tree where those 3 small graves rested. Hope slept against her chest, warm and alive. Margaret knelt carefully and placed one hand on the earth. "I did it," she whispered to the children she'd lost. "I made it through. And I promise you, I'll raise her to be strong and brave and free in ways we never were. She'll know her worth. I would be so happy. She'll never settle for less than she deserves, and she'll always know she was wanted." The wind whispered through the cottonwood leaves, and Margaret chose to hear it as approval. She stood, kissed Hope's forehead, and walked back to the ranch house that was no longer a place of loss but of new beginnings. Years later, people would still talk about the widow Holloway who traded her cattle to the Apache and received a miracle in return. Some said it was just a story, that the timing had been coincidence and nothing more. But Margaret knew the truth. She'd given everything she owned for the chance to become a mother, and the spirits had honored their bargain. Every time she looked at Hope growing strong and healthy and full of life, she knew she'd made the right choice. Some prices were worth paying. Some bargains were meant to be kept. And some miracles, the ones that mattered most, came not from prayer or medicine, but from being willing to sacrifice everything for what you truly wanted. Margaret had found her way through the darkness to the light, and she would never take that light for granted again.